First of all, welcome. My name is Dave Test. I'm the group leader for technology classrooms at Penn State University. In my spare time, I do vintage computer stuff. And today we're going to talk about how to emulate vintage computers on the Raspberry Pi. You know, it's great to have the actual computer. There's nothing that can beat the actual computer. But there's a lot of factors that might prevent someone from having the whole computer. Might be cost, might be availability, might be space, rarity of the computer, that sort of thing. So you move down from having the real thing, you get emulation, and emulation has actually progressed to the point where it can be pretty impressive what you can do with it. So what is a Raspberry Pi? So this is the sort of the media-friendly text from the Raspberry Pi website. Serves as single-board computers developed in the UK by the Raspberry Pi Foundation to promote the teaching of basic computer science in schools in developing countries. Essentially, it is a small, cheap computer. So let's look at the different configs here. There's two sort of current models, and the specs are actually kind of impressive. So you have a 1.2 gigahertz 64-bit quad-core ARM-H CPU. So that's sort of ARM processors are in 99.9% of all smartphones, and it's a very similar chip that's in the Raspberry Pi as in most smartphones. 1 gigabyte of RAM, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 4.1. You got USB, HDMI, and Ethernet. You have 40 GPIO pins. If you look on the side there, you have 40 sort of pins on a big header sticking up. 3.5mm audio, a micro SD slot, fits in the palm of your hand. It's $35. So that's the Raspberry Pi 3. There was the Raspberry Pi 2 and the original Raspberry Pi. They're all almost exactly the same form factor. This is the one that's currently in production, and so this is the one that would make sense to purchase, but a lot of the things I'm going to show would work on a Raspberry Pi 2 or Raspberry Pi 1. The other option we have is the Raspberry Pi Zero. Now the Zero is interesting because it's almost smaller than the size of a credit card. But it still has a 1 gigahertz ARM processor, half a gig of RAM, 2 micro USB slots, a mini HDMI, the same HDMI 40-pin GPIO header, although it's not populated here. You got to solder in your own if you really want to. But it's got a micro SD slot, super small. $5 without Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, $10 with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So once you get to that point, there's really not any reason to not give this a shot. It's so incredibly cheap. So let's look at the software. So at its core, there's Raspbian. Raspbian is the official Linux distro from the Raspberry Pi Foundation. It's based off of Debian Linux, which has been around for decades. It's, like I said, it's the one that the Raspberry Pi Foundation maintains, that they actively support. Whenever a new Raspberry Pi comes out or anything comes out for compatibility or updates, it's going to come to Raspbian first, because that's the one that they support. Also, if you go on Google and you search for Raspberry Pi something, chances are it's going to run on Raspbian. It might run on the other Linux distros, or it may not, but almost everyone targets Raspbian because it is the official distro. But you have other OS options. So as you look down here, you can see the standard variety of Linux distros. You have Ubuntu, FreeBSD, NetBSD, Fedora. You have Android. You have Windows 10 Internet Core. People were really excited when this first came out because they're like, oh man, I can run Windows 10 on my Raspberry Pi. It's like, well, you can run a modified version of the Windows 10 kernel that lets you remotely run apps on the thing, but you're not going to get a Windows 10 desktop. So from a development standpoint, kind of cool. From an end user standpoint, not really that useful. We have Haiku, which is an open source sort of reimagining of BOS. We have RISC OS Open, which is from the Acorns. They're keeping that OS alive. Even Plan 9 from Bell Labs, which anybody know what Plan 9 was? Yeah. So the heir to the throne of Unix. But you can still and it gets updates monthly. Like, it's impressive that people are keeping the torch alive. The one obviously that I have a fondness for and that we all have a fondness for here is the PyDP8 by Oscar. He was supposed to be here, but he had a family emergency. He has actually implemented a full PDP OS in a Raspberry Pi. So what you see here is a recreation of a PDP-8, and it's running a Raspberry Pi in the background. Very cool stuff. So let's talk about emulation. So why would you use the Raspberry Pi for emulation? Well, number one, it's really cheap. Like I said, $5 for the Zero, $35 for the Pi 3. You know, once you, obviously you're going to need a power supply, you're going to need a micro SD card, probably an HDMI cable, that sort of thing, maybe a case. So you end up looking at maybe $30 for your first and $70 for your second. Now as they update or you get, once you can swap out those things, so the price, as you have multiple Raspberry Pis, the price drops. But even so, I mean, it's really cheap. It's relatively powerful. So if you look at the chart on the right, that's the dry stone, that's integer instructions per second. The Pi 3 is at 2,458, so it's at 2.5 billion instructions per second, which puts it right around the same as a mid-range Pentium 4 PC, so sort of 2005 to 2009 timeline. But again, for $5 to $35. The whetstone on the other side is floating point ops, so it's 711 million floating point instructions per second, still very impressive. For reference, the C64 is 0.2 MIPS, so you know it's come a bit of a ways. Number 3, this is probably one of the most beneficial things to the emulation community. Android, as most people know, uses the Linux kernel. So everybody's Android phone is running at its kernel Linux. Now, Google has plans to maybe step away from that or branch it, but right now that's essentially the truth. And like I said before, ARM CPUs are in 99% of Android devices. So what that means is, if somebody writes something for Android to run on their smartphone, chances are it might already be compatible with the Raspberry Pi, and if not, it would be trivial to move it to the Raspberry Pi. So essentially, Raspberry Pi gets this benefit of this ecosystem because Android is obviously huge. It's the largest mobile operating system in the world. And there's a lot of people that want to develop for it. A lot of people commercially want to develop for it, but a lot of people that develop things like emulators, and the Raspberry Pi benefits from that. So, okay, fine. So how do I get started? So, like many things in life, there's the hard way and the easy way. Although in this case it's more the hard-ish and the easier way. Now if anybody has ever delved into Linux before, you know it's fairly straightforward. In this case you buy a Pi and accessories, you download the Raspbian Pi image, you image the micro SD card with the Raspberry Pi image, put it in the Raspberry Pi and you boot it up. And then you expand the file system, configure the audio, the video, the keyboard, the networking, Bluetooth, SSH, VNC, install the emulators, configure them all. So you can see it's a noble effort. And if you know what you're doing, it's not really that hard, but it's time consuming. And you don't get the benefit of the community that's already been helping you do this. So, you know, at this point you might be saying, but Dave, there's got to be a better way. And I'm here to say that there is. Unlike all these poor, infomercial suffering people. It's called Retropie. So Retropie is a pre-configured Raspberry Pi image focused on game system emulation. So the Retropie group takes the latest Raspbian image, and then they put scripts, set up scripts, they put a front end, they put everything on it that you need to get game system emulation up and running. So these are out of the box. These are all of the emulators that Retropie supports. So you have, you know, it runs the whole gamut. You have all the Ataris, all the Commodores, the NESs, the Segas, you know, the TRS-80, pretty much everything that you would want to emulate that's 8 and 16-bit and maybe a little bit of 32-bit. But what's interesting about this list is there's a lot of games there, which games are cool. Emulating games is great, but we're looking at vintage computing here. So if you look at this though, these are all computer emulators, and they come built in with it as well. So out of the 63 emulators that come with Retropie, you get 19 pre-configured 8 and 16-bit computer emulators right out of the box. So you don't have to do the hard work of, you know, compiling from source and installing it, managing all the dependencies, managing the updates, you know, doing all of the base configuration stuff. That's all included for you. So you have, like I said, that there's actually over 100 emulators available because in addition to that list, There's a huge list of experimental drivers that they've written support for. They may not work 100% yet, but they're there. And then you have things like the Mame mess and Retroarch projects. So Mame, for those of you that don't know, Mame was sort of the original game emulator. It was for arcade games. So it was started in like probably 98, I want to say, 99, maybe even before that. And what it sought to do was cycle exact emulation of all of the common chips that were in the arcade machines. So once you have a 6502 emulated and a Z80 emulated and a bunch of other stuff emulated, now all those things start looking a lot like a computer in addition to an arcade cabinet. The MESS project had a similar goal in that they were looking to emulate as many computers as possible. And not just things like the PC and the Apple and the Amiga, but things like Hewlett-Packard calculators and things of that nature. So that's all in Retropie. So you get that bundled in. LibRetro Retroarch is a much more modern thing. It's basically LibRetro is an API for developing game emulation cores, and then Retroarch is sort of the front end that does sort of the middle end that does the configuration management. So as anybody writes a LibRetro core, if it's within the sort of the power threshold of Raspberry Pi, pop in the Raspberry Pi, and now you have that emulator as well. And then on top of Retropie, there's a thing called Emulation Station. Emulation Station provides a GUI-driven interface. So when you boot this thing up, you're not stuck. You're not sent right to the command line. Now, some of us love that. I love that at certain times. But there are times when I want to get something done and I just want to, have a nice interface for it. Emulation Station does that. So the basic setup for Retropie is pretty easy. You configure your controller. When you first boot it up, it says, hey, press a button on the controller that you want to configure with this. So I have a little Bluetooth, somewhere here. I have a little Bluetooth controller that looks a lot like, you may or may not get to see this in action, depending on how the rest of the demo goes. Just this little guy. It looks like kind of like an NES controller. Looks Bluetooth, they're like 30 bucks on Amazon. You plug it in and it says, press all the buttons. Press D-pad up, D-pad down, D-pad left, D-pad right, all the analog sticks, all the other things, and then it says, okay. Then it takes that configuration and it applies it to most of the emulators. So in terms of the configuration for things like if you need a joystick, it's done. You don't have to go into every single emulator and do that over again. Some you do, some you don't, but it helps a lot. So you go in, you set up the controller, you set up the Wi-Fi, and then you install an emulator via something called the Retropie setup script. The Retropie setup script is essentially the core of Retropie. It's a giant bash script. And what it does is that it manages the installation, management, the updating of every emulator, all the front ends, and the OS on the Retropie image. So it's sort of the bare guts of Retropie. Once you have the emulator set up, you add ROMs. So one of the things about Retropie is that since it's primarily designed as a game system setup, it wants to launch games. It wants to launch a ROM or a disk image. So you go in and either be a USB or you SFTP or you make a network share. It makes a bunch of folders in the ROMs folder, a bunch of folders in the BIOS folder. You copy the things you want to in there. And then when you relaunch Emulation Station, it says, oh, okay, Atari 800, here's all the things that are in here and I'll launch them for you when you click it. You launch and configure the emulator, you might have to do things like keyboard setup and things like that. And then basically you just repeat that loop 3 to 5 for every emulator. So as you add a Commodore emulator, an Amiga emulator, a Mac emulator, a TRS-80 emulator, you install it, you add the ROMs, and you configure it all through the Retropie setup interface. So, this is the point at which I would show you the Retropie running on the Raspberry Pi. But we were having some issues with that, so let's give it a go again and see what happens. I almost specifically said something about angering the demo gods in this slide, but I was like, I don't want to press my luck that much. And lo and behold. So let's take a look here. Nice picture. best chance of getting the bits across. So this, by the way, is my little Retropie. It's in a $5 case. You know, doesn't have to be pricey. Put that in.
Where's the best source for parts? Amazon?
Amazon is probably the best parts. There's a lot of companies that do Retropie images, or Retropie bundles. So like CanaKit out of Canada, like those prices I quoted were CanaKit kits. For $70, you can get a kit with a Raspberry Pi and everything you need, including like a 32 gig micro SD card. You can piecemeal it too.
So the C-A-N-A.
C-A-N-A-K-I-T.
Good to know.
Adafruit also supplies them, and Element 14, Newark supplies them. There's a lot of places you can get them. I'm applying power.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there any awareness of complications with obtaining ROMs?
I have been instructed by my friends at the VCF to not speak on the legality of ROMs and BIOSes. So I'm not going to comment on that.
I have a related question.
Yes.
Is there a way if you actually already own a cartridge to get an image off of it?
There is. There's a specialty community that's all about dumping ROMs, basically. And you buy a piece of hardware, whether it's like if it's an NES, you can get like an NES contact connector to USB bridge. There's all sorts of things, and then basically just runs a piece of software that copies the ROM off and gives it to you. Yeah, so you can totally do that.
Okay.
And if it's something like a Mac or an Amiga or a TRS-80 where it actually requires a ROM image from the computer itself, there's actually tools that will dump the contents of the ROM to a file. On a real machine, then you can extract that out, and that's completely, you know, I'm not going to say completely legal. I'm not a lawyer,
It's better at least.
but it's you own that hardware.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
This is not going to
Radio
work.
Shack's lawyers have bigger things to worry
Yeah.
about.
That is probably true.
The only lawyers they have are their bankruptcy lawyers, they're too busy.
Right.
The other good place to get the pies is Micro Center.
Yes, if you live close to a Micro Center or
Like
Fry's.
$30, but you have to
Yep.
go in person.
Yep.
And for a while there, you get the, I don't know, buy one Pi Zero for $5, get a second one free.
Yes. Yeah, you go into Micro Center, there was a big bin of Raspberry Pi Zeros that said $5. Like, wow, this is impressive.
Follow-up question, where is Micro Center?
St. David's.
Especially with Jersey, yeah.
Down,
There's one down my way.
it's not
330.
Yeah. I unfortunately live 4 hours from one, but that would be so nice.
Oh, okay.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Have you tried emulating a Raspberry Pi in
King of Russia?
South Russia games so that you can make
So you mean like emulating a Raspberry Pi in a modern computer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried that. The, Raspberry Pi actually, they make a simulator, which is sort of a, you know, between an emulator and a virtualization environment. I've not seen one that's at an acceptable speed, because when you start emulating ARM, the processor power increases exponentially that you have to have. And to emulate a 1.2 gigahertz ARM, you would need a huge computer, and I've tried the fastest computer I can get a hold of, and it still doesn't do it acceptably.
Yeah, if you want to skip the Raspberry Pi, there are JavaScript emulators that use.
Yeah.
Smash.
Yeah. Yep. All right, so I must have entered the demo gods this morning, so that's not going to work, but it's all right, we'll press on. So Emulation Station, like I said, that's the front end. That's basically the thing that you see when you're running Retropie. And there's a couple of considerations to bear in mind when you're running Emulation Station. The first of which is that Emulation Station is primarily a game launcher. It's not a boot your Commodore Plus 4 into BASIC emulator, right? That's not its intent. So things like, how would you do that? Well, maybe put so like I said, Emulation Station has a folder for a ROM, and there'll be one called like C64. So you could put an empty file in there and make sure it's named correctly. And what will happen is just call it boot C64, so a 0-byte file. When you relaunch Emulation Station, it'll be like, oh, there's a ROM called boot C64. you go to run it, and it just exits out because there's nothing in the file, but it dumps you into the basic interpreter in the plus folder, or whatever you're trying to run. So there's sort of strategies that you have to employ because this really wants to run a piece of code inside the emulator that it's launching, which a lot of times you want to do. You want to play a game, you want to launch an app, or do a utility within that emulator. But sometimes you just want to be in the OS. You want to be at the DOS prompt. You want to be at a basic prompt, a CPM prompt, that sort of thing. So you have to kind of work with that a little bit. File extensions dictate what appears in Emulation Station. So for something like NES ROMs, if it's an NES ROM, it should be .NES. Makes sense? For Commodore 64, it's a .D64 image because that's essentially a 1541 or 1571 block-for-block copy of a file as an image. And Emulation Station expects them to be in certain file extensions. So if you download something or you rip something and it's in the wrong format and it doesn't show up in Emulation Station, the first thing to check is what's the file extension. Because it might just be the wrong file extension, you change it and it'll work fine. The other thing is that a keyboard and a mouse, well not necessarily a mouse, but a keyboard and a joystick are required. Because it's a game launcher, Emulation Station is designed around having a joystick. So even if all you want to do is boot into the TRS-80 emulator, you're going to need a joystick to at least get through the Emulation Station interface to launch the TRS-80 emulator. Okay. And then there's things like PAL and Ntsc considerations. So you may download a new free game that somebody had coded for the Apple II, but it might be coded for a PAL Apple II. So PAL versus Ntsc is essentially the European video standard versus the American video standard. PAL is based on 50 hertz, Ntsc is based on 60 hertz. So what happens is, you take a PAL game, you run it on an Ntsc configured computer, and unless it's aware that it might be multi-region, if it's PAL running on Ntsc, it'll be really fast. Like it'll be 12% faster because, or however much percentage faster that is, because it's expecting all the timing in the computer to be at 50 per second and you're running at 60 hertz. Most emulators allow you to adjust that in the settings. So depending on the ROM, depending on the disk image, depending on the computer, you might have to go in and say, no, this is a PAL C64C, or no, this is an NTSC TRS-80. So that is something to bear in mind. Let's see here. Whoops. Go back here. The Retropie site is your friend. For every emulator that they support, there is essentially a wiki-style page with detailed documentation on here's the files you have to have, here's where you put the disk images or the ROMs, here's when you first boot it up what you have to do, a description. There's usually a link to the actual project of the emulator, like if it's a GitHub project or somebody else's open source project, they'll provide a link to there, so you can go directly there for more documentation. But it's really friendly because it's designed to get you up and running as quickly as possible. Paths, configs, file scripts, all of like the help for, well, I really want to add this file extension to this emulator for this reason. That's all documented on the site. And there's an active forum. So you get stumped, you go in, you ask a question. I've never had a problem getting it answered. It's a very active community. And the beauty of this is if you're rolling your own and the emulator updates, and you update that emulator, depending on the person who's writing the emulator or the community, they may not have updated the documentation yet. You might not even get a change log sometimes. And so finding out what those little differences are, what improved, what broke, what features were added, can be really difficult. With Retropie, they release when things get to the point where they need to be updated, and then they make sure the documentation matches. So you're never sort of completely out in the woods with it. So you want to avoid some pitfalls when you're working with Retropie and Raspberry Pis in general. First of all, Raspberry Pi has no power button. As soon as you plug in the micro USB power, it's on. And so, because it's running a file system, that can be an issue because you don't want to pull the power while the file system's still mounted, right? So there's a couple ways of dealing with that. In the Retropie image itself, you can pull up a little sort of pop-up window that says, I want to restart the system, I want to restart Emulation Station, I want to shut down, and then it'll issue the proper Linux commands to do that in a controlled fashion. There's also things you could buy that are essentially a smart power button. So like I was talking about, there's those GPIO pins on the Raspberry Pi. What some people have engineered is a thing where you plug your micro USB power into this little PCB, and then you plug the power from there into the Raspberry Pi, and then you run 1 or 2 pins to the GPIO pins. And then on the Raspberry Pi, you run a little script that says, hey, if I detect that there's a closure on those 2 pins, run this script, which could be a restart script, could be a shutdown script. So it essentially gives you a hardware power button that's running the proper commands to shut down or reboot the computer. Because you really don't want to be running Emulation Station to just pull the power. I've corrupted Retropie images doing that. The other thing is buy a good power supply. So the Raspberry Pi 3 requires 5 volts, 2.5 amps. And when you're running an emulator, even though it might be what you think is a simple emulator, chances are it's pushing the CPU to the max. Because emulation is very processor intensive. And what that means is it needs as much power as it can get too. So if you go online and you see, on Amazon, you search for Raspberry Pi power supply and you see $399, 5 volt, 2.5 amp. Maybe, that might work well. If you see one that's like $899 and has 150 or 4 or 5 star reviews, that's probably the one you want to go with, because the Raspberry Pi used to basically, the Raspberry Pi 1, to a certain extent the Raspberry Pi 2, it would take whatever power you gave it and it would basically be okay. Now that we've hit the power requirements of the Raspberry Pi 3, you need good power. One of the things to bear in mind is, so the Raspberry Pi 3 and the Raspberry Pi Zero W has Wi-Fi built in. You used to have to buy a little USB dongle and attach it to it. Now it has it built in. The only, and it's B, G, and N, but it's 2.4 gigahertz only. So if you're like me and you had your whole house, you said, oh, I can get rid of 2.4 in my house. I don't have to worry about all the interference. I have all these channels. That's great, but you can't get your Raspberry Pi online then. So I had to go back into my router and say, okay, add another network for 2.4 traffic, and that's what the Raspberry Pi and some other older stuff live on. Restart Emulation Station after adding or changing things. So Emulation Station isn't actively scanning all of those folders for all of its files while it's running. What happens is every time you boot Emulation Station or boot the Retropie in general, it scans all of those folders and it says, okay, here's a new C64 image, here's a new TRS-80 image, here's a new Apple II image. So if you're bringing files in over USB or FTP or Samba or whatever, and then you go into the Retropie, into the Emulation Station page for that emulator and it's not working, you're like, what's going on? Just restart it and it'll pop up. The other thing is, back up your micro SD card. So inevitably, Retropie makes it fairly easy, but inevitably you're going to be in there, you're going to be working on little scripts, you might be installing little things that are, you venture off the path. And if you screw up, yeah, you can probably figure out what you did, and it might take you 5 minutes, it might take you a day, it might take you 3 days. But if you make a backup of your image and you screw up, you can just reload that image. Like I use a 32 gig micro SD card that was $15, and it takes like 20 minutes to re-image it from my MacBook Pro, and I'm back in action. So yeah, you can go the hard way and troubleshoot it, but sometimes just coming from a backup is a lot more sensible option.
Like a quick comment, I'd like to reiterate the good power supply. As ham radio operators, we run the Pi 3 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yes.
For a lot of situations, I have 5 running at the house.
Yep.
And the biggest thing that we always tell people when they contact us and say, my system's acting funny, we say, check your power supply.
Yep. Yep.
And I've taken about 50 power cubes at the house and measured them. And some of them will easily put out 2.5 amps, but it's only 4.2 volts.
Right, right.
So,
Or it'll be printed on it, it'll say like 2.52 volts or 5.2 volts at 2.5 amps.
So
it's not anywhere near
if
it.
you have problems with it,
Yeah.
relook at your power cube.
Right. If you really want it to work, an iPad power brick is basically the best USB power brick you can buy. I mean, they cost like $30-40, but if you want super clean 5.2 volts up to 12 watts of power, that's going to give you clean power.
Yeah.
So if you need it, you can pay for it and you can get it. There was another question? Yeah.
Just follow on comment, there are a bunch of nifty inline voltmeters and ammeters.
Mm-hmm.
They read out alternating volt amp.
Okay.
Adafruit has them, and probably everybody does.
So you can check your own power supply to see
Yeah,
what's going on.
They plug in line the USB.
Yeah, yeah. What'll also happen is if you're running your Raspberry Pi and all of a sudden you see this little thing that looks like a square rainbow in the top right corner, what that means is that the silicon on a chip, the SoC that actually has the CPU, the GPU, all that stuff, it's determined that it doesn't have enough power to run at full speed, so it's actually throttling down one or more of the CPU cores, which means you're not getting the performance you need, and usually means that you have a power problem. So if you ever see that little thing pop up in the top right of your corner and it won't go away, or when you first launch an emulator and it's ramping the CPU up all the way, you get this little thing and that's what's going on. It's power. It's power. So let's look at some accessories. So as I said, there's a lot of different ins and outs to the Raspberry Pi. You got the 4 USB, a 10 100 megabit Ethernet, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4, low energy, the 40-pin GPIO, a DSI display port and a CSI camera port. Those are sort of, Raspberry Pi actually makes, I think I have, yeah. So Raspberry Pi actually makes a small 7-inch touch display that connects to the DSI port. The cool thing about that is it does the touch data and the video data off of that single port. So you still have the HDMI and USB if you want to mirror out to another display in addition. A lot of people use these. I've seen people make, like, they'll 3D print a little, basically a little portable handheld that has the Raspberry Pi plus this, plus the little display controller in an interface, or in a little handheld with a battery pack. So those are really cool. I think they're like $60, $70, which for a high quality 7-inch touch display.
How well does that work? Have you seen those?
Yeah.
And they work really well?
They work well, yeah. It's actually a really high, it's an 800 by 480 resolution display.
Yeah.
And the viewing angles is pretty good. It's a TFT display. It's got 10-point multi-touch.
Okay.
It's actually pretty responsive.
All right.
But let's look at some more retro things. So the first thing that I think is pretty cool is this thing called Keyraw. What Keyraw is it's a bidirectional Commodore to USB keyboard and a translator essentially. So in this case we have a C64C, and the person's taken the Keyraw and stuck it in there. Now you can take that USB port and plug it into the Raspberry Pi, and that C64 becomes a USB keyboard for the Raspberry Pi. So if you want to do your computing on the Raspberry Pi but still have the retro feel of the old keyboard, you can do that. And this works on the C64, the 128, the 320, the +4, the 128E. It also goes the other way. So it lets you take a USB keyboard and plug it into this and then use a USB keyboard with your Commodore. So if you really want a nice, a nice modern keyboard, you can do that too. So those are really cool. The Zoom Floppy. So Jim Brain, I think he might actually be here this weekend. He makes an awesome thing called the Zoom Floppy, and it basically lets you connect any Commodore IEC bus thing or IEEE 488 thing to USB. So the typical thing is, I grew up with a C64. I have 150 5¼ boxes and a 1541. How do I get those into the computer? Well, you buy a Zoom Floppy. You plug the 1541 into that port on the side, plug in a USB, and you can run the Zoom Floppy software on the Raspberry Pi. So you can actually use the Raspberry Pi to get block copy images of your old disks and archive your old disks. So that's really cool. I think it also does printer emulation. So if you had an old IEC printer and you were nostalgic for some dot matrix noise and some, print out some long banners from Print Shop, that's your best bet. ADT Pro presses 0 to USB cable. So Apple Disk Transfer Pro. This is a really cool project. Every Apple II, from the original Apple II up to the 2GS, ROM 3, and I think even a couple of, I'm not going to say that. So basically the entire Apple II line has serial on the back. And you can run ADT Pro to either take an image from a floppy drive running on the Apple II and copy it into a modern computer, or You can take a disk image that may have downloaded like a new game or something, and you can copy that over the serial cable to an actual 5 1/4 inch disk. ADT Pro runs on Raspberry Pi, on Raspbian. It runs on Windows and Mac. It also runs on Raspbian, so you can actually use the Raspberry Pi as essentially a disk image server for your real Apple II, or you could use it to archive all of your old disks from your Apple II to your Raspberry Pi. And that's completely free. All you need is a serial cable that fits the back. Apple revved the serial port quite a few times, so some of them are around mini DIN, some of them are a D-sub connector, some of them are 9 pin, some are 25. So you need the right serial cable and then a USB interface, and it plugs right in, and then you can run ADT Pro and copy what you need to copy. This thing is really cool. This just came out actually in the past couple weeks. This is called the RGB Pi. It's a GPIO to SCART adapter. So SCART is the, like in America, we've probably, a lot of you have never seen a SCART connector. In Europe, everybody's seen a SCART connector because on the back of almost every European TV for 20 years, there's this big brick port. And that's how all the connections are made. The cool thing about SCART is that it has composite, it has S-video, it has RGB, it has composite sync on it, it has audio, it has everything you need through this one cable. It's kind of burns me that we didn't do this in America because it's such a brilliant idea. One of the limitations of the Raspberry Pi, as was painfully obvious today, is that it doesn't natively have analog video output. If it did, I could have plugged it into that projector and done the proper demo. What the RGB Pi does is it connects to the GPIO header and then it gives you analog video out through the Raspberry Pi. This is really cool if, let's say, you had an old arcade cabinet with a 15 kilohertz CRT tube monitor in it. You can get an adapter cable to go from the RGB SCART to that tube TV, and then you can run games, emulators, that sort of thing, at the native resolution and the native refresh rate of the arcade cabinet. Or if you had a professional broadcast monitor that was analog, you could use this to plug it in and get the analog image out of it. Very cool. There's also a VGA version of this that does something very similar. It actually is a little shield-looking thing. It sits on top of the GPIO and it gives you VGA out. Both pretty cool projects. So it's probably time to wrap it up. This would have been maybe 20 minutes longer if I had the Raspberry Pi, but you roll the dice. So links and resources. First of all, raspberrypi.org. That's where you get all the latest information on the Raspberry Pi, all the specs on the current models. It's also where you can download Raspbian. In addition to Raspbian, there's a there's basically a boot manager for the Raspberry Pi called Noobs. What Noobs does is it lets you have multiple Raspberry Pi images on one micro SD card. So when you boot, it immediately boots into Noobs, and then it says, okay, what do you want to run on the Raspberry Pi? You can have multiple versions of Raspbian. You can have Raspbian, Fedora, Haiku, Plan 9, all that stuff. It'll boot between them. That's all raspberrypi.org. Raspbian.org is the home for the development community for the Raspbian distro. So if you want to get down and dirty with the actual Linux distro, this is where to go. All the man pages, tips, how does this command work in Raspbian? I'm used to Red Hat or whatever. How does this translate to Debian, which then translates to Raspbian? All that stuff's on the Raspbian website. Like I said, retropie.org.uk. This is the home for the Retropie image. It's where you download the main releases. It's where the docs are, where I was talking about there's a doc for every emulator. It's an invaluable resource if you're doing this. They really do a great job. EmulationStation.org is the page for the actual front end. So if you want to build your own themes, so the Emulation Station ships with certain themes and they look good, but let's say you want to make a TRS-80 theme that has a picture of the computer in the background, or you want to skin it in some way, you can totally do that. There's documentation on the Emulation Station site for that. I'm David M. Test on Twitter, so that's usually the easiest way to get a hold of me. Thanks.
Does it make sense to have a separate micro SD card for the Retropie?
They're so cheap nowadays. You can get, that's another thing in addition to good power, get a good USB. Because the difference in cost between a really cheap micro SD card and a really expensive is maybe $10, and it can save you a lot of hassle. But yeah, like something like Raspberry Pi, or Retropie, depending on how many images you're putting on there. Like if you wanted to do something where you had every C64 game ever on it, and every Amiga game, and every Mac game, and every other thing, you might need a 32, 64, 128 gig image. But if you want to put, if you want to put 6, 7 emulators on there and run 30, 40 games, you could use an 8 gig card, which is like $10 for the good one. So you also get faster throughput, so it'll boot faster and things. But the microSD card slot on the Raspberry Pi is arbitrated as a USB device. So there's no USB 3, it's USB 2 on the Raspberry Pi. So you're not going to get like super fast transfer speeds from the microSD card because it's still a USB device. But it'll still make a difference if you buy a $5 versus a $20 card. Yeah.
There's also an option to, if you just have regular Raspbian already on, to install it right on top of that without, I mean, you just run the scripts.
Yeah, if you already have a
Run the
Raspbian
scripts.
configured, you can just download the Retropie setup script, and it'll install the whole thing for you over top of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Retropie, can you run that headless? Or do you have to?
Yes, you can. Because actually while I was developing this and while I was setting up a lot of the demo stuff that you weren't able to see, I was actually SSHing into the Retropie to do the Retropie setup and things like that. And so, yeah, you can totally run it headless.
So what, like type VNC or one of those?
So VNC will work if you're actually running the desktop, like the Raspbian desktop.
Right.
But as soon as you go into actually running an emulator, VNC is running on the XI side, and so it doesn't see like the Vice emulator for the C64, for example. But yeah.
Do you have any experience backing up or booting from thumb drives or hard drives?
So with noobs, you can boot from, you can't natively boot USB drive on the Raspberry Pi, but you can run noobs, which then lets you boot from USB. And yeah, you can do that. In fact, you could have, one of the things you can do as of Retropie 4.0, which came out maybe 6 months ago, you can actually have the Retropie OS running on a microSD card. You can have all of your ROMs and BIOS files on a USB drive. So you can sort of maintain those as separate things. Or you could have Retropie running on this and then another OS running on the USB, and with noobs you can switch between the two. Yeah.
Using the USB is a good idea if you've got something you're reading and writing a lot of.
Yeah.
Because you can, I mean, we do that, a lot of the guys do that with their weather station data, where they're grabbing their weather station every 10 minutes.
Yeah.
They put it on the USB instead of on the SD card.
Yeah, a lot of USB drives are built for higher, more read-write cycles than a microSD card. And also, if you were writing log files to that and you wanted to take them out, but not have to turn off your entire system, that would be the way to do it, because your OS is running on a separate storage than your USB.
Extension of the USB question.
Yeah.
How does it work with network attached storage?
So Retropie actually is, when you, in the Retropie setup script, you can turn on Samba shares. And so it actually presents you with a BIOS config file, ROM, and something else. And so that's just automatic. And then you can just connect to that with any SMB compatible thing, Mac, Windows, whatever. You can also, of course, make your own Samba shares. And it actually works pretty well because, in all honesty, the amount of data that you're transferring is really minimal. Like the TRS-80 boot BIOS is 4K, I think, and the biggest disk image I have on that thing is a fully prepared Mac OS System 7.1 disk image with like HyperCard and all sorts of other stuff. It's 24 megs. So yeah. Either one.
You mentioned backing up, so I'm more of a Windows person than a Linux person.
Yeah.
The way I've been backing up the SD card is to run a clone program under Windows and clone it to a file or clone it to another card.
Yeah.
But then it takes, the time of a 32 gig card, even though I only have it maybe 20% full. You have a better way of backing it up or imaging it?
So, as you get bigger, that's one of the perils of getting the bigger micro SDs. Like I have a 128 gig micro SD, and it takes like an hour and 15 minutes to do a full backup. Because even though 60% of it is empty space, it doesn't know that when it's doing a block copy, so it's reading all the blocks, and then once it writes out the file, it'll zip it, and then it'll like crunch it down to get rid of all that empty space. I've not seen anything that does like a file level copy that would be much more efficient. I've not seen, or like a difference. You know, that would be cool.
The only thing I can recommend that I've done is, I've got some old ThinkPad laptops with a card reader in it, and under Linux, you can mount that thing and do CPIO and tar and whatever.
If I have an
Yeah.
Linux system, so
Yeah.
under Windows, I'm using a program that's called HD Clone, and on Windows machines, it's smart enough to say, you know, you
Yeah.
only use this much space, and I'll
Yeah.
clone a whole machine, maybe 15
I
minutes.
think that's something that could deserve some development time from somebody, because right now it's really, it's gonna give you the whole thing. Now, there's a couple programs, there's Win32 Disk Imager that works fairly well. There's an open source initiative called Etcher, which is an open source sort of Windows, Mac, and Linux version that does block copies and does sort of, you can do version management, that sort of thing. But I haven't seen an intelligent block copy that would say like, here's a disk image, here's that same disk, so compare the two and only write out the changes. Or if I see this is all empty space, don't bother, just tell me it's empty. That's something that could definitely
I
stand
just
to be improved.
experimented for a client with what Seagate gives you free on like the little portable pocket drives.
Yeah.
And it's a version of a Cronus True Image.
Mhm.
And I was very impressed with what it did under Windows, because you could use it both as a backup and image
Yeah.
from the same files.
Right.
The docs did say it worked under Linux, but I don't know if it works the same way.
Yeah,
under
I've
Linux.
not investigated that.
For the micro SD cards,
Yeah.
the quickest way to speed it up,
Mhm.
if you have a USB 3 on your PC,
Yes.
or buy a USB 3 extractor,
Right.
and you get, I've done some tests, but I can't remember the numbers, but it's, you know, you can chop off a lot amount of
Yes.
time
Yes.
on backing up.
Especially if you're already buying a micro SD card that's built for like a camera, where it's gonna have to dump a lot of data fast to it. You know, yeah, it can really help. The other thing I was gonna say is on a Mac, if you're doing it in the command line, so when you mount a volume in the Mac, it mounts it as /dev, and then it mounts it as /rdev, which rdev is the raw. That will always give you better, like if you're DDing, like if you're just taking a DD of the whole volume, rdev will be 40 times faster, because it doesn't have to check everything through the file system layer, it just copies the blobs.
Yeah.
You know, so that can really help too.
Have you experimented with trying to do backups with just rsync over the network from your Raspberry Pi?
I haven't tried that, but I'd imagine it would work.
Because it, won't copy the files that haven't changed.
Right. But in all honesty, if it's an 8 gig image, you know, sometimes it's just easier to keep that copy and say, as of March 30th, this was my copy. If anything screws up between now and then, I'll go back to that. But yeah, rsync would work if you want to do incremental backups, or if you wanted to have like, all of my ROMs are in this NAS, but I want to make sure they're also synced in here. You can have an rsync cron job that does that. Yeah. Yeah.
There's an ext file system subsystem for Windows.
Yes.
And you can then use that and actually mount the disk directly,
Yes.
and then use any file by file.
And I've seen anecdotal evidence that that's safe for reading and not very safe for writing, because Windows, if it sees that it's translated that barrier, now it can write to it, who knows?
I've
Yeah.
done writes with the one I've had
Yeah.
for a number of years and have never had. Now, of
Yeah.
course, that's never a guarantee.
Right.
The other thing is talk about additional emulations. There's a thing called SimH, which is an emulation of everything from a Z80 Altair up through VAXs, interdata concurrent Perkinelmer 3200s from down the road. So if you're into mini computer
I
emulation,
know Earl Evans from the Retrobits podcast, he just got a VMS 380, 390, I don't remember the version. He got it up and running on a Raspberry Pi 3, which is really through SimH.
It's ridiculous.
It's really cool.
I'm running a Banana Pi,
Yeah.
which is very similar to Raspberry 2.
Yep.
With the advantage of it has a SATA interface on it, which means I'm working on making a portable NAS out of it.
Yeah.
It's got a 1 gig Ethernet on it.
Yep.
That thing was running 3 11.780s on it in parallel. While one was compiling all of Unix, the other two were just doing some small I/O.
Right.
So you don't realize that this toy is worth about $250,000 in 1985 computing.
I mean, the Act is a 1-bit CPU, so.
Yeah, it's not that
Barely.
bad. Right. And speaking of the Banana Pi, there's Asus just released, or they just announced a thing called the Tinker Board, which they're claiming is a Raspberry Pi compatible, but the CPU is like 3 times faster. It's got USB 3, SATA, gigabit Ethernet instead of 10100, a bunch of other stuff. They haven't shipped any in quantity yet, but I think they're gonna be $75.
What's it called?
It's called the Asus Tinker Board. So it's not in wide distribution yet, but I've seen some people get their hands on them. So that'll be really interesting because then that opens things up to maybe 32-bit emulation or maybe having multiple things going, get more horsepower, right? So, yeah.
Let me ask you, Dave, besides emulation and the retro stuff with this, have you done anything else with the Pi?
So one of the cool things about Retropie is you can install Kodi on top of it, Kodi, which is the, it was started as the Xbox Media Center. So you can basically turn your Raspberry Pi into a home theater PC for streaming video and audio and pictures. And you can actually launch Kodi right from Emulation Station, or you can have the Pi boot into Kodi. So most of the time it's sitting by your TV, being your movie server and your video server. And then through Kodi you can say, launch Emulation Station, and now you can get to all your emulators. So that's one of the really cool things I've seen.
The only thing that we're waiting to try and get on that is the ability to do Netflix from the Pi.
Yes.
That's the stuff.
Yes.
To hang, but
Yep.
I just tried the latest Firefox, because it said Firefox now put the content management stuff in there to allow it to talk to it.
Right.
Works fine on Linux, does not work on ARM yet.
Yeah, those binaries are still x86 only, unfortunately, but someone will port them eventually, I think.
Do you know if it's possible to read ripped DVDs? To play ripped DVDs?
Through Kodi, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. It wouldn't play, like if you had a Blu-ray rip, that's probably a little bit too high bandwidth to do reliably on the Pi 3, but a 480p rip from a DVD, yeah, it plays perfectly. Yeah.
Do you do any programming for ARM?
I do not.
Does anybody here? No? Okay.
Python works great on it. Actually, if you want to teach kids programming, Python on the Pi with the library Let's Talk to Minecraft is awesome.
Yes.
Or allows them to build stuff in the game with
videos of
Python.
that.
The scary thing about the Debian and I've been playing a lot with Ubuntu, and I tell you, the amount of stuff in their repositories ready to just grab it and run is ridiculous.
Yeah, the app package manager for Debian has hundreds of thousands of things in there. And the nice thing about Raspbian is Raspbian maintains a subset of the apt repos that it knows will work on Raspbian. So if you go into the command line, you say sudo apt-get and you want to search for something, or just apt-get search for something, chances are it's there. Like there's an Apple II GS emulator that's not included with the Retropie image. You just go in and you type like 2 commands, and now you have an Apple II GS emulator. So it's pretty amazing. Same way.
There's a ton of really, I've been seeing a lot of action on Linux-based CPM emulators. And all of those will work.
Yep.
There's I belong to a group that deals with HP calculators, and there's a guy there that's got a whole bunch of HP calculator emulators that run on the PC.
Yeah.
You use the Net4 framework.
Okay.
And you use Mono on the Pi.
Oh, to run that as well.
the exe directly.
Right.
And all the emulators run on it.
Yeah. There's also the MES emulator, which is built in, and it itself has support for like 40 or 50 of the HP calculators. So it's amazing. The breadth that you can get is amazing. What I'd really like to see is somebody branch the Retropie image and make a computer emulation image based on Retropie, so they can build on that, but add things that the average kid that just wants to play every Super Nintendo game wouldn't necessarily care about, but stuff that people like us might care about. I'd really like to see that, and I honestly don't think that'd be that hard to do.
Did you ever try the Android on it?
I've not tried the Android. It's from what I hear, it's really bare bones, and it doesn't have the Google Play Store. Because in order to have the Play Store, you have to have Like Android is open source until you want to do anything Google with it, and then it's really not open source anymore.
But you
you
can
know?
load, you can load
And
all
so-
the APKs if you
Yes, you can sideload everything you want, but like,
So any app that you have on your phone, you can save the APK.
right,
Export it,
Yeah.
and reload it.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a site on the net, OpenGApps.
Mhm.
If you search for OpenGApps, they have a Google Apps installer and.
Okay.
Now, it's been out there for years, I've used them on my phones because it's been used with CyanogenMod and all that.
Right.
So it's out there, I don't know, they haven't been shut down by Google, they're
yeah.
findable through Google, it's
Right.
kind of like, I don't think anyone cares.
I
But if
think-
you want to get the GApps on here, you probably can do
I
it.
think unless you're hitting their servers, they don't really care.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, thanks so much.